Great. Thanks everyone for this debate. Before I give the call, I think the only general commentary of this debate is there are a lot of assertive contesting frames and dynamics in this round. So very rarely do teams actually ever operate within another person's frame or justify explicitly why someone's type of circumstance they're talking about or type of manifestation of the world they talk about is either sufficiently untrue or sufficiently less important, even though it is true. So a lot of teams are either just sniping at each other's assertive claims or just counter-asserting. This means that the clashes become incredibly quite challenging to arbitrate at times when there are all teams in this round are plausibly true in some circumstances. And it's sometimes very unclear to know why I should prioritize your circumstance over another, which produces thus close comparisons and potentially calls that people will not like. I don't think there is like there's only two simple comparisons to resolve in our minds in this debate. Nevertheless, because I had two trainees, my call became our ultimate call, and thus has to be unanimous because I can't disagree with myself. So we gave the first to the team in closing opposition, the second to the team in opening government, the third to the team in closing government, and the fourth to the team in opening opposition. We thought the only quite obvious comparison was the long diagonal. The other comparisons are in some ways quite tight, close, and there are alternative reasons to why the comparisons could be flipped. I'll try to engage in that latter point as much as possible to illuminate why we didn't think this was ultimately persuasive. And I think it'll add a lot of clarity, hopefully, to the call that happens. Cool. I'm going to justify this chronologically then. So let's start at the top half then. The top half has some degree of a metric agreement, which is both top half teams think that there's something about the aspect of a connection that religious people have to their faith that is ultimately important in this round. There's not just only explicitly demonstrated by opening government, as in they weigh why given that there are some people who can opt in and out of faith and achieve different systems of meaning, those people ought not to be prioritized because obviously there's no delta in their sense. Indeed, because the value that you can get from a religion could theoretically by meaning be extracted in other ways. Opening opposition to a certain extent do contest this by saying religion has a ultimately important value of things like meaning and identity. This is quite vague piece of characterization, as in presumably identity and meaning could be ascribed to other things that are non-religious. But in some ways, that contesting by open opposition doesn't matter because all that open government is trying to demonstrate is there are some people who just don't leave religion or don't leave a religious sphere because they need it so much. And thus, this debate is about what these people feel within each of the type of theology. So these people better served in their existential crises by positive or by negative faith. That's where the simplicity of the top half stops. So there are, from that, multiple different instances both top half teams are bandering around about where existential crises can come from. So an opening government has one or two conceptions. Opening opposition has another one or two conceptions. Opening government argues that people undergo hardship, and when they undergo hardship, they seek religion as an answer and solace. That's one type of instance when individuals are using their faith to remediate their need for security and catharsis. And they say this can't be achieved if you have an amorphous or very confusing set of beliefs and systems, because what people actually want here is not to be confused, they want to be comforted. They just want a certainty that moral truth is therefore true and consistently believed. Opening opposition has the sort of inverse contention, which is there are times at which individuals are fine, but they encroach upon crises because they can't resolve themselves to the truth, the moral truth laid by religion. So this is better articulated in DLO, but is present in leader of opposition, which is to say that if you have such a firm belief system or a firm tenet, you have a higher system of doubt because it's like there's only one conception and it's so obvious and rigid that sometimes your life will contest what this rigid thing is, as in the problem of evil is a good example here, is you can't conceive of a world in which God is merciful because it just confronts your lived experience. And this puts people into existential crises. So you see, both of these things are frames that can operate do operate independent of each other because these are two different types of scenarios. We are unclear which of these scenarios is more numerous, is more important, because both of them are affected by opening government's vulnerability, weighing of presumably people who can't leave religion might also have these two harms. Indeed, if opening government is correct, that people definitely won't really leave religion, then the question of how religion is able to mediate both opening government and opening opposition frames is quite important. How then do we arbitrate this? And this comes down to a conception of diversity, or where individuals are actually able to opt into theoretically things they couldn't opt into otherwise. So it's the question of comparative exclusivity and analysis. But there's also, secondly, a question of rebuttal, namely, which team does at least some more job of demonstrating that the inverse team's view of the world is untrue. Neither team directly contests the truth of either frame, which is, I think, which is probably correct because both are true to a certain extent, as in some people have existential crises because of positive religion. Some of them are resolved by positive religion. A clearer way of arbitrating this would be to weigh one of these types of sub-instances against each other in either of this case. So if we look at the analysis then, so how does opening opposition tackle the analysis of the claim about why positive religions are bad? They say it is because individuals dissociate from religion because theoretically they mustn't be able to get something they want to get. Opening government's contention is that isn't true because the way in which religion manifests, and this is responsive work by DPM, is religions have a selfish incentive to increase the amount of buy-in and thus decrease the radicalization for very selfish incentive reasons. And they want state power, they want people, and it creates a check and balance mechanism that therefore decreases the amount of criticism and in some ways decreases the diversity of perceptions, but in itself means that you have less extreme conceptions and those that are less likely to be disagreed with. This analysis is useful, but not lethal. So it is useful because it demonstrates to us that potentially the number of existential crises you would have might not be as extensive as opening opposition contend with, as in more people than not, religions that are positive, more likely than not, will try to interpret things in ways that are going to be palatable to most people to prevent the type of crises opening opposition emerges. And thus a mutual exclusivity is created in the frames, as in now we believe marginally fewer people do what have the experience DLO argues, which is where they find something wrong with religion and they can't resolve it, versus opening governments of people needing the solidity of a definition in the first place. The inverse type of analysis isn't done by opening opposition, as in there's no explanation opening opposition against opening government's frame to why people don't need a system of security and comfort by a theoretically stronger religious authority, but just a consistent message in itself. So this is one example of a responsive challenge that produces an asymmetry that we're willing to latch onto as judges. The second thing to say then, the other analysis, the second thing why it's not lethal, which is why it gives opening opposition a leg up, is if you're conceding that there's a less of a diversity of religious beliefs, then presumably that engenders opening opposition's version of their rebuttal, which is then there's going to be some people who aren't able to opt into that diversity of that belief, and thus that is harmful for them because they have a bad conception of their religion. And the opening opposition says fundamentally this resolves down to individuals having epistemic humility, as in now they just think that they don't actually know what is true, which means against opening government, they would never enter into this problem of feeling distant and feeling disparate of God. Here we end up back to the same problem again, which is both of these things can be true at the same time, and no team explicitly weighs them off against each other. So as judges, we're left with using, unfortunately, quite BP-esque metrics to arbitrarily top up. The first is after the teams have agreed on the metric of what happens to religious people is important, we have to use intuitions at this level. So what do we think the AIB would more likely believe to be true? That individuals are so unable to opt into certain interpretations of faith with positive theology that they can't overgo crises, or that having no system of no system of consistent theology would prevent individuals from having a sense of stability. We think the second seems more intuitive than the first, given a lot of the sort of justifications provided by prime ministers themselves about why a sense of connection is valuable to God in particular. The second justification opening government provides to why and this is on a rebuttal justification, is opening government. I think we do believe do more damage to opening opposition than opening opposition due to opening government, particularly on the comparative justification in DPM about why the types of religion or ideologies you'll opt into are likely to be bad rather than good because you're doing it on a very emotional basis. So even if opening opposition is correct that you'll be able to opt in and interpret a negative theology in a way that is beneficial, that is good for you, we question whether or not it actually would be good for you at the end of DPM's rebuttal. We think maybe you opt into a very emotive harm that maybe is good for you but could be harmful to people around you, which is the rebuttal that comes to 4 minutes. We think this rebuttal, therefore, is sufficient for us to understand why the frame of the people opening government talk about are more worthy than what opening opposition talk about, and also more true to actually manifest per the comparative analysis in the first justification. So that is an extensive read of top half. I think it is quite important. I deliberately spent this long on top half because I think it is important to position the extensions relative to this. So ultimately, competing frames, but the rebuttal and justification from opening government was marginally better able to demonstrate why their frame should be considered by the panel to be more true and indeed more important, largely because of both implicit analysis, but also explicit use of rebuttal. On the government bench then, what does closing government add to the round? So closing government describes that by having a more consistent religion in terms of positive theology, you end up humanizing, because God is humanized, you therefore see God in other individuals. And thus, not only is religion therefore better able to be communicated and shared because there is a consolidated view, this humanization creates a more humanistic moral system that creates within individuals a feeling of self-worth, but also creates pro-social behaviors. What happens on Gov Bench then? The first thing to say is that we do think closing government potentially extends the margin of how many people end up buying into this faith or having a conception of the faith. We think the first part of member of government is quite good at describing why a consistent message is easier to communicate and therefore easier to be believed. We don't think this is a sufficient arbitration, as in we don't think this is sufficient in of itself to massively extend the margin of opening government such that it is a meaningful extension, given the problem with the second part of the extension, which is the comparative mutual exclusivity of the claim. So it's all well and good for closing government to prove that more people opt into a religious positive theology than negative theology, but presumably this is not an a priori good thing. So CG is arguing consequentially that the reason this is good is because people opt into a more pro-social behavior. So the Gov Bench analysis is which team do we actually think demonstrates the manifestation of pro-social behavior? Is it closing government's conception through framing about pro-social behavior, or is it opening government's contention about self-correcting types of religion and the deterrence from negative emotionality, which is the thing I raised at the end of top half? That second question is far more important than the first one, which is to say we can grant closing government everything and say we believe that individuals would opt into a positive version of human values rather than a negative version. I think I had more problems with this contention than the other people in the panel. I don't think closing government meaningfully demonstrates why you opt into a positive human value, as in you see others inherently as valuable in human just because God has some positive human values. Presumably the POI probably from opening opposition is partially correct, that you still have a biased conception in group versus out group considerations. This isn't important on Gov Bench, so let's just give you your credit here and say this is sufficiently true. What isn't sufficiently true is the comparative justification. So the comparative comes quite late in the member of government, and I don't think it's really instantiated in government whip, which is you can't display an aspect of human value and it creates a vacuum, and that is why that is bad. So the question on Gov Bench is, who do we think better demonstrates not just the positive, but also the absence of the positive at off bench? We think we're unclear why just because a negative faith doesn't have a human reaction or human connection, you can't by its nature have a human related value. Because if opening government themselves are to be believed that there is interpretability in the opening opposition, interpretability and self-optionality, why don't you opt into the bad things? Opt into the human values that closing government think are so good. It's only opening government on Gov Bench that provides the reason why you don't, which is the DPM's justification for why you are likely to opt into negative, very emotional and very destructive behaviors if you don't have that system of stability that you can't opt out of. This is therefore a comparative justification to explain why the benefits of positive theology can only manifest because of positive theology. Another way of saying this, maybe a less EPL way, is it's more connected to the motion insofar as it has fewer steps of analysis required for us to believe this is only existing on your side. This isn't to say that CG don't have a margin. They still beat opening opposition because they have a margin. We just don't think the margin is, as in the reframe and contesting of what a positive pro-social value is through the way you value God, is more persuasive than opening government's check-back self-corrective mechanism. Here we require explicit analytical weighing here to us to understand why closing government at the very least don't think that DPM's reason is as persuasive as their reason. On prima facie, on face value, the reason I just gave is the reason why we don't, is that we think opening government had the stronger comparative justification for why the positive values of religion can't exist from negative theology. On the short diagonal, though, this one's a different consideration, which is opening opposition's contention is people who have bad existential faith, and people interact with each other badly, particularly out-group versus in-group stuff. This EG contention we think is persuasive insofar as it creates like a parallel route over opening government, and they're not dependent upon opening government. They have a unique route to explain why people become better human beings, as in they value each other because they see an extension of God within people. They then weigh this above the contention of individual faith. Actually, no, they don't. They do it in two things. The first is they argue that the individual conception of faith can also be through things like self-value. So if you think there is an aspect of God within you, this creates a stronger emotional this creates a good emotional connection. This is obviously parallel to opening government's argumentation about how social connection is caused by understanding. I'm not sure why the connection you feel emotionally is more persuasive than the understanding from opening government, but at the very least, it's a different form of mechanization against opening opposition. So when it comes to things like systems of faith, I could relitigate what happens on top half, but it becomes somewhat simpler in the shorter diagonal, is in unlike opening government, closing government wishes to argue that there is a normative change in society. I don't think there's any arguments from opening opposition why normative change can't happen, nor why normative change isn't important. Indeed, opening opposition in their war analysis, which we discounted on top half because we did think it was so far away from the burden, nevertheless demonstrates opening opposition care about the way this affects wider society beyond religious groups. We think in terms of the steps of analysis, CG was more close to getting to show why people treat other people positively, as opposed to opening opposition showing why people treat others negatively. Indeed, it seems to be the metric opening opposition wishes to use because they POI CG about in-group versus out-group bias, namely that you'd still hate an out-group of a different religion. I think the humanization and argumentation from closing government has yet to be demonstrated by opening opposition to not be true. We think it plausibly is true that you see a characteristic of God within everyone, and thus this creates some more positive value that you affect individuals. Or at the very, very least, even if opening opposition destroyed closing government on this angle, there's still the positive aspect of faith that we think is universalizable beyond just the niche frame opening opposition had about individuals who undergo a subset of crises. So opening opposition, like some people are affected badly because they can't understand or they can't relate to this core tenets of religion. Closing government has a universal benefit of self-worth and valuation of individuals when they feel as if they have a human connection to God. Thus, they can outweigh implicitly by the scale effect of what they're talking about versus the minority effect of open opposition. Given OO did not justify why the subscale of crises of religious individuals matters more than the way all religious people feel about themselves, and they're able to project that to non-religious people in society, it's unclear why we should prioritize open opposition's frame over closing government. Last but not least, then, opening. No, let's not go back to opening. The last but not least is closing opposition, which is somewhere. I was right in front of me, sorry. What is closing opposition contention around? I think this is the simpler comparison around, which is why I'm going to spend less time explaining it. So closing opposition's contention is just human-based interpretation is good because it creates more capacity for positive opt-in and it creates via things like greater intercompetition. The simplest way to explain why CO is able to beat the room is how they utilize opening government's analysis against them. So opening government, to their largest extent, explain that intercompetition, like the check back mechanism of opening government is dependent upon some perception of intercompetition. So the reason that a religion is trying to ameliorate or desire concerns is because their selfish power is somewhat linked to the way individuals buy in or don't buy in. Closing opposition should argue having more numbers of these religions creates the effect opening government has just for more individuals. Closing opposition also contends, unlike other teams like opening opposition, why the positive aspects of things like value, either it's human value or it's just intrinsic desire to understand God, whilst it can't, obviously by nature of the motion, can't be ascribed literally, can nevertheless be manifested literally, as in you're better able to change text that exists beyond God by having an interpretive stance. This is the Quran versus other types of religious sects. That you have an increased capacity for self-interpretation, but also you make religions more likely to have a self-justification push, as in they're more likely to do the thing opening government said in response to opening opposition against individuals' crises of faith. This makes it clear why closing opposition's analysis for us can apply in a multiple of different instances of the frame that exists on top half. So people enter existential crises in many different ways. Closing opposition analysis can universalize to many of these types of crises at the point at which they describe why intercompetition creates a diversity of religions that allows people to opt into them. The second thing that closing opposition does relative to opening government and thus opening opposition is some sort of argument of they're able to cater to both the psychological, but also the material needs. The material needs argument we think is less persuasive insofar as the margin to that claim is quite large. Sorry, the margin is quite small, as in there's the steps to analysis that were unclear why actually the demands manifested change. But at the very least, we think there is some argument here that there is a better material extractive capacity, because if you have a smaller religion, you're better able to have collective action against that religion. And that presumably this is another example of the scale benefit here. So relative to opening government tries to convince us that people have a better relationship with their faith. Closing opposition argues they are better able to do so when they can have interpretive capacities themselves. This produces a clearer margin than opening opposition and thus constitutes a better response. We also think it's just more plausible that individuals can opt into a good version of their religion through them, as in closing opposition rather than OO. So I think OG is correct partially about negative opt-in, but closing opposition contends that individuals would overwhelmingly likely opt into the positive versions of their value, or at the very least religions, because they're intercompeting, would manifest a version of that and justify a version of that that would make individuals not opt into that negative emotional aspect. But on the final comparison, which is the back half, the question just comes, is God's humanization a unique and indeed a worthwhile positive compared to sect intercompetition? The challenge from closing government here is to just try to explain why it is an asymmetric value. We don't think this is true. Namely, we think closing opposition do, on the back half, show that you can have intercompetition within sects, and thus you don't have the type of demonization that closing government is trying to respond to. The strongest response from CG here is to say the relatability of God is what is the impeding factor. It's actually unclear why this is true. This is obviously claimed by both gov teams. Closing opposition into competition analysis suggests that isn't. The second response by closing opposition is to say you just couldn't remove yourself from religions in the first place. You're too indoctrinated by your family. Closing opposition's contention is this could be true, but is less true when you have negative religions, because there is less of a codification and less of a desire to discriminate each other because you don't know what the objective truth is. So if God is less relatable, closing government's first response, it must be the case it has less power over individuals, and thus the opposition whip's response to CG must be true. This is just to say that you can have aspects of humanization, maybe on closing government, but you can also have the same aspect of humanization and more positive affections also in closing opposition's world as well. Thus, thus the closing government challenge had to be why into competition that can't happen in a constructive way, rather than just saying it can't happen a priori. We think it is not able to happen in all instances. We do think closing government is true in some instances. We even think closing government might be true that there is some demonization between sects. This does not prevent closing opposition being true that you should opt into the sect that is most preferable to you, which by its nature could be a humanizing value, but also could be something that is better for you, unless you have a better relationship with your faith. The final way closing government could be closing opposition is by justifying why the wider world is benefited by humanization uniquely. We don't think the link is achieved yet for that clash to be important, as we don't actually think closing government has demonstrated why a positive human value manifests more than a negative human value, which is the response closing opposition gave both within a POI and also an opposition whip. We think whilst this question exists, we don't see the link to why the wider society becomes better, and thus this social normalization clash doesn't become important in the round because we don't think it's activated analytically. Thus, we default to the psychological clash, which, as closing themselves it agrees with, is important in terms of the self-confidence and belief of a person. If people are able to opt into a better religion for them, they probably have a better sense of religious belief and confidence within themselves, and thus the metric would fall to closing opposition on that piece of analysis. That is how we saw the debate. Extensive OA because it was an extensively tricky debate. I will stick around as long as you would like me to stick around to talk about the debate and feedback. But good job, everyone.